In the dying days of the 20th century, the Modern Library commissioned 2 polls to find the greatest modern books. The first, aimed at scholars, returned predictable results like The Great Gatsby. But the second poll, aimed at the general public, was a different story. The top of that list was occupied not by Fitzgerald or Hemingway, but by a Russian émigré who arrived in America barely able to speak English and wrote only 4 novels, all of which were critical failures. Yet from those few books, Ayn Rand built a philosophical edifice which would inspire some of the most powerful people in America. Born Alissa Rosenbaum, Ayn Rand's early life was marked by non-stop catastrophe. As a child in Russia, she witnessed firsthand the violence of the Bolshevik Revolution, an event that left her with a lasting hatred of socialism. Yet Rand was more than just an anti-communist. A radical believer in the individual, she embraced both a militant atheism and a libertine lifestyle that was shocking to her mid-century contemporaries. Misunderstood in her lifetime, still controversial today, this is the life of Ayn Rand, America's objectivist icon. At the moment Ayn Rand first opened her eyes on February 2nd, 1905, it must have looked like fate had just handed the new baby the shortest of short straws. The daughter of a successful pharmacist, Rand was born into a comfortable middle-class home in the grand city of St. Petersburg, then the capital of Imperial Russia. Growing up, the girl had servants, nurses, and a mother who was positively aristocratic. If you're wondering what's so short straw about all of this, though, you only have to look at Rand's birth name, Alissa Rosenbaum. As you can probably guess, the Rosenbaums were Jewish, and sadly, Imperial Russia in 1905 had no time for Jews. For months, the country had been in the grip of the worst anti-Semitic violence in centuries. When Rand was just 8 months old, her parents received word that 2,500 of their co-religionists had been massacred in the Odessa Pogrom. It was entirely possible that they'd be next. But violent anti-Semitism wasn't the only thing threatening the Rosenbaums' once stable world. 1905 was also the year of the First Russian Revolution, when anger at a lack of domestic freedom and getting stomped in a faraway war exploded into waves of unrest. Although hurried reforms would leave the Tsar still standing, the imperial system had been badly strained. All it would take was one more shove, and the rotten edifice would go crashing down. Spoiler alert for Russian history here, that shove was now only 12 short years away. Not that the young Rand realized she was living through the prologue to a coming dystopia. Her childhood was both dull and frustrating, hampered by her incredible intelligence and even more incredible cynicism. When her teacher set an essay on the joys of childhood, Rand instead wrote a screed condemning childhood as an intellectual wasteland. Perhaps it's no surprise then to hear little Ionochka spent most of her free time alone, absorbed in books and movies. By 1914, aged just 9, she had decided she was going to be a writer. But not just one writing in the Russian tradition. Even as a child, Rand hated the mysticism of her homeland, a fact that would lead her to declare herself an atheist at 13. But while young Ayn Rand spent the mid-1910s plugging away, churning out 4 novels about a brilliant, misunderstood preteen girl, the old religious Russia she hated was already on the verge of collapse. That summer, 1914, Imperial Russia entered World War I. Although the Tsar was on the winning team, his crumbling regime wouldn't make it over the finish line. By March of 1917, or February according to the Julian calendar still in use in Russia at the time, the war had so shattered the nation that the capital exploded in Revolution No. 2. For 12-year-old Ayn Rand, the February Revolution was a thrilling time. She cheered from the sidelines as the Tsar's autocracy went down in flames. She cheered, too, the soft liberals who came to power as the provisional government. She even expressed support for the moderate socialist Aleksandr Kerensky. It was a brief flirtation with the left, and it would certainly be her last. 8 months later, in October of 1917, Kerensky and the provisional government were overthrown and replaced by Lenin's Bolsheviks. It was a pivotal moment in history, one that established the world's first communist state. It was also the moment when the last traces of Rand's comfortable bourgeois life vanished for good. While many Russians were cautiously optimistic about the Bolsheviks, Rand hated the new government from the get-go. Not even aged 13, she frequently spat invective about Lenin, causing her family to fear for her safety. But this was Russia in 1917. Everybody feared for their safety. When the Civil War broke out, the Rosenbaums fled to Crimea to escape the violence. There, they lived in a desolate, unheated home for several years while Rand finished her schooling. By now, the teenage Rand was sure of one thing, that she hated communism even more than she hated religion. But she hadn't yet found anything she loved, any ideological framework she could admire as an alternative to socialism or Tsarism. That all changed in her last year of high school. Taught for the first time about the political system in the United States, Rand became convinced that America must truly be the land of the free. But while she would eventually move there, she first had to deal with several more years in the lands of the incredibly not free. In the early 1920s, with the Civil War winding down, the family returned to St. Petersburg, soon to be renamed Leningrad, so that Rand could study at university. Her father had intended to resume his business, but the Bolsheviks had confiscated it. Undeterred, he tried to start over, but when his new business was likewise confiscated, he declared he was on strike. From then on, the Rosenbaums would lead lives of poverty and grinding hunger. Still, Rand managed to continue her studies, but even in the closed-off world of college, the chill winds of revolution were still able to seep in. Before Rand's eyes, the communist government was clamping down on freedom of thought, on education, on everything. By the time she graduated in 1924, Russia was already on the slippery slope from the police state of Lenin to the nightmare murder gulag of Stalin. And it was clear Ayn Rand wouldn't survive this change. She was outspoken, intelligent, arrogant. She was vengeful and proud and insulting. Although she was capable of being charming when she wanted, she refused to kowtow to the guys with guns and gulags. If she stayed in Russia, it was clear there was nothing in her future but a late-night knock at the door and an anonymous grave somewhere in Siberia. So in 1925, the Rosenbaums agreed for their daughter to go and stay with relatives in America. For Rand, this was the dream come true. Ever since that high school class, she had idealized America with its industry, freedoms, and mighty Art Deco skyscrapers glowing like 1,000 beacons. Of course, she couldn't tell the Bolsheviks this. She told them she was just going for a short trip that should be back in no time. But both Rand and her parents knew that she'd never return. The girl left Leningrad in early 1926, heading west along a route traveled by so many immigrants before her. She turned 21 while passing through Berlin and celebrated by changing her name from Alissa Rosenbaum to Ayn Rand. In later life, she'd say that the Rand part came from her beloved Remington Rand typewriter, but since Remington Rand wouldn't incorporate for another year, it's clear this was a fabrication. By late February 1926, Ayn Rand had arrived in New York. Although the sight of America's greatest city made her weep, she wouldn't stay there for very long. Her first 6 months passed in Chicago, just long enough to get the visa extension she needed to secure her future stateside. And then it was off west, to the Golden State, to a magical place where dreams come true. Ayn Rand was going to go to Hollywood. To say Rand's life changed in Hollywood is to underestimate just how head-spinning this transformation was. 2 days after arriving, the director, Cecil B. DeMille, offered her first a lift in his car, then a job as a salaried extra, and then work as a scriptreader. Mere days later, she'd met and fallen in love with her future husband, Frank O'Connor. As a wise teenager once said, life moves pretty fast. But maybe not fast enough. Despite landing on her feet, Rand would spend the next few years utterly failing at writing. This wasn't for lack of trying. She kept meticulous diaries, including making detailed notes on the serial killer William Hickman, who she called a man who really stands alone in action and in soul, a brilliant, unusual, exceptional boy. Today we can see Rand's obsession for a forceful man like Hickman as a kind of early kernel for her future characters, in terms of egoism at least. But at the time, she was just an obscure emigre trying to catch a break. It wouldn't come easily. Although she managed to sell a script to Universal, her attempts at literature were repeatedly shot down by editors who called her characters stereotypes and her themes obvious. Still, Rand persevered. In 1934, she staged her first play. Although given different names by different theaters, it's best known today under its New York title, The Night of January 16th. That's important because it was the play's run in New York that convinced Rand to finally pack her bags and leave the city that never sleeps. The move was all the inspiration she needed. Rand landed a job at an architectural firm and almost immediately began work on a novel about an architect. If you know anything about Rand, you'll already know that this book would become The Fountainhead, her breakthrough novel. But it would take her a long, long time to finish. For now, Rand focused on producing a pair of shorter novels that would be easier to sell. We the Living was a semi-autobiographical story about life under the USSR that landed to mixed reviews and mild sales, while Anthem was a dystopian sci-fi that was published to an even weaker response. Still, the two books kept her going through those lean times, kept her going long enough to finish her architecture novel and find a publisher. In 1943, The Fountainhead was finally released. For Ayn Rand, and for millions of Americans, it would change everything. If you only know Rand for her politics, you might imagine The Fountainhead is an objectivist screed about an unbridled Superman repeatedly punching the government in the testicles. But the novel is really a story, one that centers not on rigid philosophy, but on universal themes. Its heart is Howard Roark, a visionary architect who would rather destroy his own work than see his vision compromised. Surrounded by mediocrities, Roark's story is of a man fighting to stay true to himself as an artist and as a human. But The Fountainhead goes beyond just Roark to tap deep into American ideals. There's the glory of human achievement, the creativity Roark brings to people's lives. There's the excitement of seeing Roark succeed not because he's rich, but because he's talented, unlike his rival Peter Keating, only in the game to impress others. Basically, it's a celebration of hard work, artistry, and being yourself, all wrapped up in a readable, if overlong, drama. It's no wonder it became a hit. Although The Fountainhead first appeared to mixed reviews and slow sales, it quickly became a word-of-mouth success. By the end of the year, it was big enough for Rand to sell the rights to Hollywood, with herself attached as a screenwriter. Nearly 20 years after arriving in America, the woman who'd once been Alissa Rosenbaum had made it. She was successful, newly rich, and with a career ahead of her as a best-selling writer. And really, Rand could have stopped there, could have rested on her laurels and kept turning out books about passionate architects. But Rand had bigger ideas, weirder ideas. She didn't want to stop at fiction. She wanted to change the world. In the end, Rand didn't return to New York for 8 years. 8 years during which she wrote the screenplay for The Fountainhead, watched it get turned into a meh film, and began to work on her final novel. But it wasn't all creativity. In 1947, Rand testified against her fellow screenwriters at the House Un-American Activities Committee, a witch hunt that inspired Arthur Miller's The Crucible. While it makes sense in the context of Rand's own experience with communism, it was still a moral low point. Still, the HUAC appearance was a minor event in Rand's life. It would be a meeting in 1950 that had the biggest impact on her future. That year, Rand started receiving fan letters from a young UCLA student called Nathaniel Branden. 25 years Rand's junior, Branden nonetheless seemed interesting enough for Rand to suggest they meet. It was a decision that would change both their lives. Branden was blown away by Rand's charm and spiky personality. People later said that he staggered out of their first meeting like someone who had had a religious experience. For her part, Rand was smitten. At first, she was just seduced by Branden's admiration for her, but that seduction was about to get a whole lot more literal. In 1951, Branden and his wife moved to New York City. Shortly after, Rand insisted to her husband that they follow the pair to the Big Apple. Although Rand always admired powerful men who dominated women to the extent that The Fountainhead contains a sex scene that wouldn't look out of place in 50 Shades, in real life, she always called the shots. So O'Connor dutifully followed her to the city, and when Rand announced in 1955 that she was going to have an affair with Branden, O'Connor didn't object at all. Interestingly, the affair didn't cause any bad blood between Rand and her husband, who still doted on her. What it did do was provide Rand with an intellectual muse. Across the 1950s, Rand worked feverishly on her book. One speech alone took her 2 years to write. At the same time, she and Branden expounded on her growing philosophy to a new circle of admirers. Night after night, people would congregate at Rand's New York apartment, joining in debates that lasted till morning, debates in which she developed her thoughts. No longer were her themes just the unfettered individualism and creativity of The Fountainhead. Working with Branden, she was constructing a whole edifice of thought, one that was strongly pro-capitalism, strongly anti-religion, and celebrated self-interest as humanity's driving motor. These themes would profoundly shape her final novel. Released in 1957, Atlas Shrugged is a tome, the sort of book you could easily use to give someone a concussion. The story of John Galt, who leads the geniuses of the world on strike, it was both a paean to individualism and a heavy-handed allegory in which the main character spends 60 damn pages spelling out the novel's themes. If you're watching this, you probably already have an opinion on it. The world of Galt's Gulch is either a dream of rugged individuality or a nightmare of Nietzschean Superman beholden to no one. Yet it's worth pointing out the novel is more nuanced than its reputation suggests. Yes, Rand celebrates powerful, wealthy geniuses, but she also celebrates blue-collar workers who bring passion and experience to their jobs and attacks rich parasites who do nothing for their money. Still, it's not a novel you can call subtle. And that's sort of the point. By 1957, Branden and Rand were actively building the philosophy they'd soon call objectivism. Atlas Shrugged would be its first conscious expression. Good job, it was a phenomenal bestseller. Although reviews were so dismal that Rand plunged into depression, John Galt wouldn't feel this, she moped to her diary, it made stacks of cash. It also cemented Rand as one of the most influential writers in America. By the late 1950s, Rand and Branden were working hard to get objectivism into the mainstream. They published newsletters, even opened schools in Manhattan where Branden spread the word. The audience their teachings found were young, but they'd grow to be hugely important. Plenty of Rand acolytes served in the Reagan administration, most famously Alan Greenspan, chair of the Federal Reserve. For Rand, these were heavy times. She was so confident in her new philosophy that she plowed all her money and energy into it, seeing herself as on a mission to save America from socialism. She also felt confident enough to attack those who shared her goal but preferred other methods. There were the early libertarians who she dismissed as hippies, scum, and plagiarists of her work. There were the religious right who she denigrated as militant mystics unsuited to power. More damagingly, she also turned her poison pen on her own followers. Where Rand's apartment had once been a space for fierce intellectual battle, it was now a place for fawning students to sit at her feet and learn in reverential silence. Any hopeful objectivists who disagreed with her on anything would be cast out of the movement, as would those who displeased her on some personal level. And Rand was about to be betrayed on the most personal level imaginable. In 1968, Rand discovered that Branden was sleeping with another, younger woman. Although objectivists should see this as Branden's moral right to pursue his own happiness, that's not how Rand saw it. She expelled her lover from objectivism, shut down the schools it opened, tried to have his writing career sabotaged. The blowout was so big that it basically fractured her new movement, ending her stranglehold on objectivism. In the wake of the split, new groups with new interpretations of Rand's work sprang up across the country, much to the author's annoyance. Not that there was anything she could do. In writing her novels, Rand had struck a chord with millions of young people across America. While that was great for sales, it also meant that there were now uncountable people out there who had formed their own ideas about John Galt and wanted to take his teachings without all the other objectivist crap. Rand could either ride this wave of feeling, or she could fight against it and be swept aside. She settled for the latter. Post-1968, Rand's personal influence waned even as the influence of her novels grew. It probably didn't help that her physical health was giving out. Back in 1942, Rand had started taking amphetamines in a rush to finish The Fountainhead. By the late 1960s, she'd been addicted for decades, and that addiction was taking its toll. But it wouldn't be drug use that put her out of the writing game once and for all, but something far more tragic. In the early 1970s, Rand was diagnosed with lung cancer. Although a major operation saved her life, it left her exhausted and too weak to even continue printing a newsletter. The medical bills also cleared her out. In the wake, both she and her husband were forced to apply for Social Security benefits. While Rand rationalized this as restitution for the taxes that had been stolen from her by the government, it was still a bitter pill for this lifelong individualist to swallow. But even this wasn't the worst thing to happen to her that decade. Frank O'Connor died on November 9th, 1979. Although she'd carried on a multi-year affair with Branden, Rand had always been devoted to her husband. His death devastated her, shattering whatever spirit she had left. After that, it was all downhill, even as avowed fans of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged descended to the highest levels of government. Even as objectivism took root on Wall Street, Rand herself seemed to fade from public life. In one of her last appearances, Rand rallied against the new president, Ronald Reagan, whose courting of Christians she despised. It was just another sign that the times had moved on, leaving her behind. Modern conservatism had taken a lot from Ayn Rand, but it could survive quite happily without her. Ayn Rand died on March 6, 1982 in her New York apartment, her only company, a nurse. At that moment, it was over a quarter century since Atlas Shrugged had come out, and nearly 40 years since the success of The Fountainhead. With objectivism no longer a unified movement, it must have seemed like she would soon be forgotten, that her relevance would quickly pass. But instead, the opposite happened. In the years after her death, sales of Rand's books only grew. By the late 1990s, her work was selling nearly as well as the Bible in America. When the 2008 crash hit, millions of conservatives turned to her work as a roadmap out of recession. Fast forward to today, and politicians, actors, CEOs, and ex-presidents all proclaim themselves as fans of her work. In many ways, this may well be the perfect legacy for Ayn Rand. Here was a woman who was critically ignored in her lifetime, who struggled to make any impression with the elites who today grew up reading The Fountainhead and learning of John Galt. Ayn Rand's story is many things. The tale of an escapee from Soviet rule, of a traumatized immigrant who lived out the American dream. But more than anything, it's the tale of a woman who did her best to live life on her own terms. She may not quite have been one of her own characters, but Rand was certainly, objectively, unique. So I really hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please do hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you for watching.